For decades, the Mariana Trench was just a point on a map, the deepest scar on Earth's skin, a number on an atlas. Then machines began to descend, and what we pulled up from that darkness turned the trench into a kind of archive. Of life that should not exist, of geology still shifting, and of our own footprint stamped into sediment at the bottom of the world. These are 10 real discoveries from the depths of the Marianas that are as beautiful as they are unsettling. Some change how we think about life on Earth. Others force us to confront how connected, even contaminated, our planet truly is. Before we begin, a quick note. If this countdown is pulling you in, subscribe and stay with us to the end for the full investigation. 10. A biodiversity shock where none was expected. For much of the 20th century, the Hadal Zone, the ocean below roughly 6,000 meters, was assumed to be almost lifeless, a frozen graveyard of detritus and microbes eking out an existence. Then explorers lowered cameras and samplers and found the opposite, a crowded, weirdly thriving world. Microbial communities exist in vast numbers, metabolizing energy from chemicals rather than sunlight. Whole assemblages of animals, amphipods, polychaete worms, sea cucumbers, and snailfish patrol the slopes and abyssal plains. In the Challenger Deep and nearby Hadal trenches, scientists have documented species new to science and high local abundances of organisms previously unknown at those depths. The biological surprise is not only the presence of life, but the diversity of strategies life uses to live there. Some organisms feed on marine snow, the slow fall of organic particles from surface waters. Others exploit chemosynthetic processes driven by minerals and reduced compounds in the sediment. And microbial mats and biofilms colonize fractures and sediments, performing chemical work that would astonish a biochemist used to sunlight-driven ecosystems. Why is this unsettling? Because the trench is not an isolated test tube. It is an active sink for matter and compounds from the surface. That means whatever we release into the ocean, plastics, chemical pollutants, radionuclides, hydrocarbons, can end up concentrated in communities that evolved to be stable but slow to recover. New species discovery is thrilling. The realization that our actions reach even the most remote corners of the biosphere is deeply troubling. To an environment that behaves like another planet. Go down to the Challenger Deep, and the environment itself becomes alien. Pressure increases roughly 1 atmosphere every 10 meters of depth. At the trench's bottom, that pressure is on the order of 1/100 atmospheres, enough to crush a steel sphere if it were not specially designed. Temperatures hover near freezing. Sunlight is absent. The chemistry of the water changes under compression. Gases dissolve differently. Viscosity changes subtly, and the physical behavior of organic molecules alters. These physical constraints force life to evolve in extreme ways. Membrane lipids shift composition to remain flexible. Proteins are sculpted to resist collapse. Cells adopt novel osmolytes, small organic compounds that stabilize enzymes. And bacteria form pressure-adapted membranes and enzymes that function under enormous hydrostatic stress. Microbial communities exploit chemical gradients where tectonics and sedimentation expose reduced compounds. Animals find niches in sediment traps and near seep-like environments. In short, the deep trench is not merely cold and dark. It is a high-pressure chemical reactor, a place where ordinary biochemistry is stretched to its limits. Yet the trench is no hermetically sealed planet. Currents, landslides, and the inexorable fall of marine snow connect it to the surface. The same physics that make it extreme also make it a recorder of global processes. Climate-driven productivity shifts, massive storms that wash organic matter into the sea, and even atmospheric nuclear events leave signatures that travel down through the food web. 8. Microplastics and human debris at the bottom of the world. If you picture plastic as something that floats in gyres or washes up on beaches, think again. Samples taken from the deepest trenches and animals collected there reveal microplastics and small fragments of human-made materials, even in the Challenger Deep. Sediment cores, snails, amphipods, and other abyssal creatures have been found containing microplastic fibers and fragments. Microscopic particles are ubiquitous in marine snow. They hitch a ride from the surface, becoming embedded in organic aggregates and sinking to the seafloor. The implications are difficult to measure but immediate to imagine. Microplastics can act as vectors for other pollutants, absorbing persistent organic compounds and heavy metals, and they can physically interfere with feeding and gut function in small animals. At Hadal depths, where metabolic rates can be slow and reproduction cycles extended, the biological cost of chronic contamination may be high, even when individual exposures are small. What we cannot yet quantify is how these particles alter community structure, nutrient cycling, or the long-term health of Hadal ecosystems. The presence of human detritus at the deepest point on Earth is a stark reminder that there are no truly untouched places left. 7. Nuclear era signatures buried in abyssal life. Atmospheric nuclear weapons testing in the mid-20th century injected measurable amounts of radionuclides and altered radiocarbon into the atmosphere. Those isotopic signatures did not stop at the sea surface. Studies have found bomb-derived radiocarbon and other nuclear-era markers in deep-sea organisms and sediments. The mechanism is direct: carbon fixed near the surface, now carrying an altered radiocarbon signature, forms part of marine snow that slowly sinks to the deep. Over decades, those particles become part of Hadal food webs and sediments, recording past atmospheric conditions like rings in a tree. When researchers analyze organs, shells, or organic matter from Hadal organisms, they can detect isotopic ratios consistent with bomb-produced carbon. This is not exotic speculation. It is measured evidence that events on the surface are written into the chemistry of the abyss. The unsettling part is conceptual. Nuclear tests, global pollution, and other global-scale activities leave fingerprints where we least expect to see them, within organisms living under 10,000 meters of water. 6. An actively changing seafloor, mud volcanoes, lavas, and tectonic motion. The trench is the surface expression of a colossal geological machine, the Marianas subduction zone, where the Pacific plate dives beneath the Philippine plate. That motion does not merely form a V in the ocean floor. It drives earthquakes, creates mud volcanoes, exposes deep-seated rocks, and moves sediments that bury and uncover habitats. ROV imagery and sediment cores have shown cooled lavas and extrusive materials at trench walls, and geologists have documented upslope and downslope sediment flows that transport materials into the trench. Mud volcanoes and fluid expulsion sites introduce chemicals and reduced compounds to the sediment-water interface. These fluids can carry methane and other hydrocarbons, sustaining chemosynthetic microbial communities in an environment without sunlight. Landslides and turbidity currents can bury communities in minutes, reworking the seafloor and creating pulses of disturbance. Over geological timescales, the trench records tectonic cycles and the composition of subducted material. On ecological timescales, sudden events can abruptly change habitats that species have adapted to over generations. Interlude A: The Hydrophone Mystery and the Slow Fall of Marine Snow. One of the more cinematic episodes from deep-sea research involved an unidentified acoustic signal recorded by deep hydrophones, a persistent, low-frequency sound that puzzled marine scientists. Initially mysterious, these recordings launched an arc of investigation that is a case study in the scientific method. A curious observation, multiple hypotheses, cross-disciplinary analysis, and finally a resolution grounded in evidence. Subsequent analysis by agencies including NOAA, augmented by modern pattern recognition methods and artificial intelligence, linked the signal to vocalizations and movement characteristics of deep-diving beaked whales. The mystery was not alien. It was biological and terrestrial in its origin. But it required decades of data and new tools to untangle. If the acoustic mystery demonstrates scientific patience, marine snow demonstrates planetary connectivity. Marine snow is an unglamorous, constant rain, aggregates of dead plankton, fecal pellets, sediment, and organic detritus that slowly sink from the productive layers above. These aggregates are the primary energy subsidy to the abyss, Their composition and rate of fall vary with surface productivity, storms, and plankton community composition. When surface waters bloom, whether driven by seasonality or climate change, pulses of richer marine snow can transport fresh organic matter to deep communities, triggering feeding, reproduction, and even ephemeral blooms of benthic life. The trench functions like a slow conveyor belt, a history of surface conditions, human pollution, and atmospheric events deposited layer by layer into deep habitats. 5. Marine snow, lifeline and ledger. Expanding the idea of marine snow, researchers view these particles as both lifeline and ledger. In oligotrophic, nutrient-poor regions, what arrives at the bottom may be thin and nutrient-poor, a diet barely sufficient to sustain hadal communities. In productive regions, or following large surface events, the hadal zone can receive a feast. The variability matters because many deep-sea organisms have life histories tuned to infrequent resource pulses. Some species delay reproduction until a large input arrives. Others have physiological bursts that exploit a sudden abundance. This means that changes on the surface, altered nutrient cycles from climate change, shifts in phytoplankton communities from warming, or human-induced eutrophication, can change the rhythm of life in the trench. Marine snow also acts as a vector for contaminants. Microplastics, radionuclides, persistent organic pollutants, and trace metals can become entrained in these aggregates and delivered directly into the guts and tissues of hadal fauna. The deep sea thus serves as both recipient and recorder of global environmental change. That ledger gives scientists a way to reconstruct past events, but it also shows us how present-day actions accumulate consequences in places we rarely see. 4. Giant single-celled engineers, xenophyophores. Among the most astonishing inhabitants of the deep are xenophyophores, giant, single-celled protists that can build complex shells and structures the size of a fist or larger. These organisms are not small. Some specimens span tens of centimeters, with networks of cell threads and secreted tests that trap sediment, fecal pellets, and mineral fragments. Xenophyophores create microhabitats on the seafloor, increasing habitat complexity and providing shelter or substrate for smaller organisms. In essence, single-celled architects build reefs on the abyssal plain. Xenophyophores illustrate the novelty and complexity of deep ecosystems. Their presence complicates any notion that the hadal zone is a simple, low-diversity wasteland. Instead, the trench hosts organisms that engineer ecosystems, modulate local chemistry, and influence sediment dynamics. Because xenophyophores are often slow-growing and sensitive to disturbance, they are vulnerable to physical disruption, for example by plowing sediment for mining or by turbidity currents triggered by seabed activity. Their fragility is a cautionary example. Some of the trench's most remarkable organisms may be among the least able to recover from human disturbance. 3. Amphipods and the mystery of mineral armoring. Deep amphipods suction up marine snow and scavenge detritus, but some species appear to do something stranger. They are coated with mineral films. Observations and analyses have documented amphipods in hadal trenches with incrustations or coatings that include aluminum hydroxides and other mineral phases. One hypothesis is that these coatings arise from the amphipod's interaction with sediment and dissolved ions, possibly as a byproduct of gut chemistry or behavior that results in precipitation on the exoskeleton. Another is that glacial or tectonic weathering supplies certain minerals that sorb onto surfaces. Regardless of precise mechanism, the result is striking. A biological armor that may protect against predators, abrasion, or digestive parasites, or it may simply be a passive accumulation with unknown consequences. Laboratory analyses suggest that these coatings can be composed of aluminum-bearing minerals and phosphate compounds, but the exact biochemical pathway is not fully resolved. These amphipods are emblematic of how life adapts using local chemistry, sometimes in ways that look like technology. The unsettling angle. When we disturb sediments that carry these minerals, we could disrupt unique adaptive phenomena that evolved over evolutionary timescales. 2. Hydrocarbon-degrading life under crushing pressure. Hydrocarbon-degrading bacteria are familiar in surface oil spills. Engineers and microbiologists have long studied their capacity to break down petroleum compounds. What surprised researchers is that similar metabolic pathways appear to function under the enormous pressures of the Hadal zone. Microbial consortia isolated from deep sediments can oxidize hydrocarbons and thrive at high pressure and low temperature. These bacteria employ enzymes adapted to the Hadal environment, and in some cases, researchers have successfully replicated aspects of their activity in pressure vessels in the laboratory. The potential applications of such organisms, from bioremediation strategies to the discovery of novel enzymes for industrial use, are substantial. But there is a cautionary side. The existence of hydrocarbon degraders in the deep might be interpreted as the ocean's capacity to clean itself, yet the reality is complex. Rates of degradation under Hadal conditions may be slow. The metabolic processes release byproducts and alter local chemistry in ways that could have cascading ecological effects. And if deep-sea mining or a subsea accident releases large quantities of hydrocarbons where these communities live, the ecological outcomes are uncertain. Novel biochemistry is fascinating. Assuming it will solve our problems for free is perilous. Interlude B: Technology, Governance, and the Ethics of Going Down. By now, it should be clear that the trench is both scientifically invaluable and vulnerable. That realization sets the scene for a second interlude: the geopolitical and economic scramble for seabed resources, and the technologies that make it possible. Remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, human-occupied vehicles, HOVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, deep-sea rigs, sediment corers, and specialized samplers have allowed us to peer into the abyss. Hydrophones and long-term moorings record sound and chemistry over years. These technologies make discovery possible, and they make exploitation technically feasible. At stake are polymetallic nodules and other mineral deposits rich in manganese, nickel, copper, cobalt, and trace metals used in modern technologies. The International Seabed Authority regulates mining in international waters, but faces pressure from states and companies that see strategic value in accessing seabed minerals. National research programs in multiple countries, along with private firms exploring extraction technology, have accelerated interest. Environmentalists, many marine scientists, and some governments have called for moratoria or very strict regulation until we understand the ecological consequences. What is often lost in headlines is nuance. Nations invest in seabed research for multiple reasons, including scientific discovery, mapping hazard risks, and assessing economic potential. Corporations pursue technologies that may one day be lucrative. Regulators like the ISA are trying to craft frameworks to balance resource access and protection. The terrifying part is not greed on the one hand or science on the other. It is that our knowledge of the deep is still too limited to predict the long-term consequences of large-scale disturbance. The deep may be resilient in some ways, but many of its inhabitants are slow-growing and adapted to stable conditions. Disturb them and recovery may take centuries. 1. The strategic stakes: nodules, cables, and global vulnerability. At the top of the list comes a combination of economic allure and strategic risk. Polymetallic nodules scattered across abyssal plains contain metals critical for batteries, electronics, and renewable technologies. Securing access to these resources promises strategic advantage. At the same time, the abyss hosts global lifelines, submarine cables that carry the bulk of international data, and infrastructure such as pipelines and research platforms. The prospect of mining, cable overlap, and expanded subsea activity raises questions about cumulative impacts, conflict, and governance. International bodies, industry groups, and national governments debate how to proceed. Scientific voices emphasize precaution, arguing for more baseline studies and for experimental impact assessments that use large area time series monitoring before any commercial-scale extraction occurs. Environmental NGOs and many oceanographers have urged moratoria, at least until the consequences are better understood. Regulatory bodies face hard choices, permit controlled exploration, and learn through careful experiments, or hold off until the science is more complete. Either path carries risk. The deeper ethical question is less technical. Do we have the right to plunder habitats that we barely understand for resources to power technologies that themselves may contribute to planetary stresses? There are pragmatic counterarguments. Some proponents claim that seabed minerals could reduce pressure on terrestrial mining and associated social harms. Others counter that deep-sea mining could create novel, poorly reversible ecological damage. Real-world policy discussions balance competing needs: decarbonization goals, economic development, biodiversity protection, but the trench will be one of the places where those trade-offs play out most starkly. Putting it together, two truths the trench keeps teaching us. First, isolation is an illusion. The deepest places on Earth are not isolated natural laboratories. They are receivers and recorders of global processes. Chemical signatures from atmospheric testing, microplastics from our textiles, and macroscopic debris all arrive at the bottom, integrated into food webs and sediments. Marine snow is the mechanism, and the trench is the ledger. What we do at the surface is archived in the deep. Second, ignorance and power are a dangerous combination. We possess technology to observe and disturb, institutions that can authorize exploitation, and industries ready to mobilize resources. But our ecological knowledge of Hadal systems is limited. Many organisms are slow to grow and slow to respond, and the recovery timescales may extend beyond human planning horizons. The presence of unique adaptations, mineral armoring on amphipods, giant xenophyophores that engineer habitats, and pressure-adapted microbes with novel biochemistry suggests that disturbance could erase evolutionary experiments we barely understand. What should we do? Science alone cannot answer this ethical question, but it can inform it. We need more long-term monitoring, open data, and rigorous impact assessments. We need international governance that privileges precaution when uncertainty is high. And we need public engagement. Decisions about ocean stewardship are social decisions, not just technical ones. A final, unsettling question. The Mariana Trench holds wonders that expand our sense of what life can be, and where it can persist. It also holds traces of our mistakes. Which of those two readings will dominate the next century depends on choices we make now. Will the trench remain a living archive that teaches future generations about planetary processes, or will it become another repository of irreversible human impact? If this investigation has made you curious and uneasy, there is more to explore. Watch our next episode on global subsea infrastructure and digital vulnerability to see how the ocean floor shapes modern geopolitics. If you found this countdown compelling, subscribe, share with someone who cares about the future of the ocean, and keep asking the difficult questions. The bottom of the sea is not the end of the story. It is where our story with the planet deepens, for better and for worse.